the last person anyone expected to find in the silent, sterile halls of the Lee mansion was a child. It was 3 a.m. when the feared head of the Korean syndicate, Tae-sung Lee, returned from a meeting that had ended in blood and cold whispers. His security detail remained at the perimeter, leaving him to walk into the darkened house alone. But then, a sound. Not a floorboard creaking, not a window sliding, but a soft, rhythmic scraping coming from the kitchen floor. Tae-sung's hand moved to the weapon at his waist, his intense, serious gaze scanning the shadows of the doorway. Any other night, an intruder in this house meant a permanent disappearance. Tonight, it meant something that would shatter his world of absolute control. He stepped into the kitchen, flipped the light, and froze. There, sitting on the cold tiles in a neat pink dress with a white collar, was a young girl. She wasn't a thief. She wasn't a spy. She was a ghost hiding in the light. Tae-sung stared down at Ruby R. Wells, the 6-year-old daughter of his quietest maid, Shirley. The girl was calm, her soft features focused as she held a fork, eating cold rice and kalbi leftovers from a plate the staff had discarded hours ago. She didn't look up in terror. She didn't even seem aware of the dangerous, tattooed man standing over her in an open black suit, his chest covered in the dark ink of the syndicate. When Tae-sung finally found his voice, the child looked at him with eyes that believed she was invisible. She whispered the words that hit him harder than any rival's bullet. "It was going to the trash anyway, Mr. Lee. Please don't tell Mommy I'm here." His chest tightened. He looked at the intricate tattoos of war on his own skin and then at the small, fragile girl who thought she only deserved the food the world had thrown away. Shirley was the one worker who never complained, the one who worked triple shifts without a word. Now, he understood the secret she was hiding in the mansion's shadows. For a long moment, the man known as the Dragon said nothing. Then, he slowly put his weapon away and did something that would leave his lieutenants, his guards, and every person in that city absolutely speechless. "Stay with me until the end." Because the choice Tae-sung Lee made in that kitchen didn't just change Ruby's life. It proved that true power isn't about who you fear, but who you choose to protect. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Now, let's get into it. The hum of the industrial refrigerator was the only sound in the kitchen as Tae-sung stood motionless, his silhouette casting a long, jagged shadow across the white tiles. He was a man accustomed to subordinates trembling at his approach, yet the small girl in the pink dress didn't flinch. She merely adjusted her grip on her fork, her blonde ponytail swaying slightly as she looked up with a calm, youthful focus that felt entirely misplaced in a house of secrets. "The lights were off," Tae-sung said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that usually commanded a room. He didn't move closer, acutely aware of the stark contrast between his ink-covered chest and her modest, white-collared dress. "How long have you been sitting on my floor, Ruby?" The girl swallowed a small bite of rice before answering, her voice barely a whisper but steady. "Since the big clock in the hall chimed 10, Mr. Lee. Mommy says the floor is for people who aren't supposed to be seen. If I stay down here, I'm invisible, and the shadows keep me safe." Tae-sung felt a cold tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the midnight air. He looked at the discarded plate of kalbi, food he had barely touched before dismissing it as an afterthought, and then back at the child who treated it like a treasure. "Does your mother know you're eating trash?" Ruby shook her head quickly, a flicker of worry finally crossing her soft features. "Please don't tell her. She works so hard so I can have my magic milk for my heart. If she knows I'm hungry, she'll give me her bread, and then she'll be too tired to finish the laundry. I hide in the pantry during the day so she doesn't get in trouble for having me here." She paused, her dark eyes searching his face for a sign of the monster his reputation suggested he was. "Mommy said if the boss found out I was here, we'd have to live in the bus station again. She said you like everything perfect and quiet." "I can be very quiet, Mr. Lee. I'm the best at being invisible." Tae-sung reached out to the kitchen counter to steady himself, his fingers brushing against the cold marble. For 30 years, he had demanded perfection and silence, never realizing that beneath the floorboards of his sterile empire, a 6-year-old girl was starving herself to preserve it. He thought of the millions in his accounts and the blood on his hands, all of it feeling suddenly sickeningly hollow against the backdrop of a child hiding in a pantry to save her mother's job. "You aren't a ghost, Ruby," he said, his voice softer than any of his men had ever heard it. He took a step forward, not as a predator, but as a man who had finally seen through the shadows of his own making. "And in this house, nobody eats from the floor," Gemini said. The sun rose over the Lee estate with a cold, clinical brilliance that did nothing to warm the heavy silence of the previous night. Tae-sung did not sleep. He remained in his office, the image of Ruby sitting on his kitchen floor etched into his mind like a scar. By 7 a.m., he was standing on the second-floor balcony, his black silk robe open to reveal the ink of the dragon across his chest, his gaze fixed on the service entrance below. Shirley J. Wells arrived exactly on time, her posture a masterpiece of forced composure. To any other observer, she was merely the efficient, soft-spoken woman who kept the mansion's marble floors gleaming and the linens crisp. But through Tae-sung's sharpened focus, the facade began to crumble. He watched as she paused for a fraction of a second before entering, her hand resting against the doorframe to steady herself. Her fingers were trembling, a fine, persistent shaking that she tried to hide by clutching her utility bag tighter. As she moved through the grand foyer, Tae-sung followed her progress from the shadows of the mezzanine. He watched her kneel to polish the baseboards, her movements slow and deliberate, as if every inch of progress cost her a piece of her soul. She was a woman running on the fumes of a mother's desperation. He noticed the way she glanced toward the kitchen pantry every few minutes, her eyes darting with a frantic, protective instinct. She was checking for a ghost, the daughter she had hidden in the darkness to keep her world from falling apart. When she finally moved to the dining room to set his breakfast table, Tae-sung stepped out from the shadows. Shirley jumped, a small gasp escaping her lips as she nearly dropped a crystal glass. Her face paled, the deep brown of her skin taking on an ashen hue as she bowed her head low. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lee," she whispered, her voice thin and fragile. "I didn't hear you come in. I'll be faster, I promise." Tae-sung studied her, noting the dark circles beneath her eyes and the way her modest uniform hung slightly loose on her frame. She wasn't just tired. She was starving herself to keep Ruby fed and medicated. The weight of her quiet maid persona was a crushing burden, a suit of armor she wore to protect her child from the man she believed he was. "Shirley," he said, his voice devoid of its usual lethal edge. She flinched at the sound of her name, her trembling hands retreating into the folds of her apron. "Yes, sir? Did I miss a spot? I can redo the entire hall." "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the chair at the head of the mahogany table, the seat of power in his house. Shirley's eyes widened in sheer terror. She looked at the chair as if it were an executioner's block. "Mr. Lee, I have work to do. The laundry, the study." "I didn't ask about the laundry," Tae-sung interrupted, his serious and intense gaze locking onto hers. "I told you to sit." As she lowered herself onto the edge of the velvet cushion, looking like a bird ready to take flight, Tae-sung realized that the silence he had demanded for years was actually a scream he had simply refused to hear. The dragon of the syndicate had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, never realizing that the most important battle was being fought by the woman now shaking in front of him. Tae-sung dismissed Shirley for the day with a cold efficiency that masked his true intent, watching from his window as she walked toward the bus stop with the same hollow, exhausted gait he had observed earlier. He waited exactly 1 hour before stepping into his obsidian sedan, navigating away from the manicured lawns of his estate and into the decaying heart of the city. He didn't need a map. His intelligence network had provided the address of the cramped, third-floor walk-up where Shirley and Ruby spent their few hours of rest. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete and broken promises, a sharp contrast to the sterile, expensive scent of his own halls. When he reached the door, he didn't knock. Instead, he stood in the shadows, his serious and intense gaze cataloging the chipped paint and the 3 different locks on the door. A mother's desperate attempt to keep the world at bay. Finding the door slightly ajar as Shirley hurried to change for her second shift, Tae-sung stepped inside with the silent, predatory grace of the dragon. The apartment was a singular room that breathed with the crushing reality of a triple-shift life. On a small cot in the corner, Ruby sat in her pink dress, her blonde hair caught in the afternoon light as she colored on the back of old grocery receipts. She looked up, her soft features showing no fear as she recognized the man from the kitchen floor. "Are you lost, Mr. Lee?" she asked quietly. Taesung didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the kitchenette. He walked toward the cupboards, pulling one open to find it entirely bare, save for a single box of generic crackers and a row of glass jars filled with colorful pills. Ruby's magic milk for her heart. He opened the refrigerator to find nothing but a jug of water and a small container of leftover rice. There was no bread. There was no milk. There was only the evidence of a woman who was systematically erasing herself so her daughter could survive. Shirley emerged from the bathroom, her hair pulled back for a night of cleaning offices, and froze. Her breath hitched, her trembling hands flying to her mouth as she saw the powerful Mafia boss standing in her sanctuary of poverty. I was coming back, sir," she stammered, her voice thick with the terror of a woman who thought she was about to lose everything. "I just had to get Ruby settled before my next shift." Taesung turned, his sharp jawline set as he looked at the empty cupboard, and then back at the woman who had spent years hiding this truth behind a quiet, perfect mask. The East Asian man with the ink-covered chest looked out of place in the dilapidated room, but for the first time, he didn't feel like a stranger. He felt the stirrings of a boy from the slums of Busan who knew exactly what it meant to have an empty stomach and a heart full of hope. "You aren't going to your next shift, Shirley," he said, his voice carrying the weight of an absolute command. "And this is the last time this cupboard will ever be empty." The obsidian sedan did not return to the mansion. Instead, it cut through the neon-drenched district where the city's predatory underbelly thrived. Taesung sat in the back, his serious and intense gaze fixed on a ledger he had summoned to his tablet. The numbers were an insult. A cleaning agency that siphoned 60% of Shirley's meager wages as a placement fee, coupled with high-interest payday loans that ensured she would never truly own the hours she worked. He felt the cold, calculated anger of a man who dealt in power, watching how these small-time leeches bled a woman who was already transparent with exhaustion. The car pulled up to a nondescript office above a betting parlor. Taesung stepped out, his black blazer open, the dark, intricate ink of the dragon on his chest visible in the flickering streetlights. He didn't bring his enforcers. For men like these, his name alone was a death sentence. He walked past the terrified receptionist and kicked open the door to the agency director's office. The man inside, a mid-level shark named Park, began to bluster until he looked into Taesung's eyes and felt the sudden, crushing weight of an apex predator in his small room. "Shirley Wells," Taesung said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "Her contract is void. As of this second, she is no longer an asset of this office." Park stammered, his eyes darting to the tattoos on Taesung's neck. "Mr. Lee, there are protocols. The fees, the outstanding debt for her daughters." Taesung leaned over the desk, his shadow swallowing the man whole. "The only thing outstanding is your life, should you ever contact her again. You have been stealing from a woman under my protection. That 60% you took? Consider it a down payment on your continued breathing." He tossed a single, heavy gold coin onto the desk, a syndicate mark that signaled a debt had been moved to the highest level. "The debt is mine now. If you want to collect, come to the mansion and ask me personally." Park's face turned the color of ash. He knew better than to argue with the dragon of the syndicate. Within minutes, the physical contracts were shredded, and the digital records of Shirley's high-interest loans were wiped from the server under Taesung's cold, watchful eye. Taesung walked back to his car, the adrenaline of the confrontation settling into a grim satisfaction. He pulled out his phone and made a single call to his head of finance. "Transfer the title of the apartment building on 4th Street to Shirley Wells, and set up a direct deposit for her new salary. Quadruple the agency rate." As the sedan glided back toward the estate, Taesung looked at his hands. They were stained with the history of his rise to power, but tonight, they had done something he hadn't expected. He hadn't just cleared a maid's debt. He had started to pay back the ransom for his own soul. He had spent years demanding silence and perfection, but now he realized that the loudest statement he could ever make was ensuring that Shirley and Ruby would never have to be invisible again. The obsidian sedan glided back through the iron gates of the estate, But Taesung did not go to his office to count his profits. Instead, he walked straight into the grand kitchen. His presence, marked by the sharp jawline and the dark, intricate ink of the dragon on his chest, stilled the room. He looked at his head chef, a man accustomed to preparing sterile, perfect meals for a lonely boss, and gave a command that bypassed the usual ledgers of efficiency. "Prepare a feast," Taesung said, his serious and intense gaze brooking no argument. "Everything. The kalbi, the mandu, the seasonal banchan. And do not let me see a single empty plate." By the time the sun began to dip behind the city skyline, the grand dining room, a hall of mahogany and crystal that usually felt like a museum, breathed with the aroma of sesame oil and charred short ribs. Shirley stood by the sideboard, her trembling hands tucked into the folds of her apron, her face ashen as she watched the table being set for more than one person. She looked as though she expected a firing squad, not a dinner invitation. "Ruby," Taesung called out, his voice a low vibration that carried through the hall. The girl emerged from the shadows of the mezzanine, her pink dress a bright splash of color against the somber wood of the mansion. Her soft features were curious, her dark eyes wide as she took in the spread. She looked at the floor, perhaps expecting her dinner to be served there again. But Taesung stepped forward and pulled out the heavy, velvet-cushioned chair at the head of the table, the head of house seat where only the dragon usually sat. "Sit here," he said, his voice softer than Shirley had ever heard it. "But that's your chair, Mr. Lee," Ruby whispered, her ponytail swaying as she looked up at him. "Mommy said I'm supposed to stay in the shadows." "The shadows are gone, Ruby," Taesung replied, lifting the small girl and placing her into the seat of honor. "In this house, the guest of honor sits here." Shirley let out a choked sound, her hands flying to her mouth to stifle a sob as she realized her daughter was no longer a secret to be hidden, but a person to be seen. She moved to serve the food, her instinct to work still driving her. But Taesung caught her arm with a firm, surprisingly gentle grip. "Not tonight, Shirley," he said, his sharp eyes meeting her glossy, tear-streaked ones. "Tonight you sit next to her. The agency is gone, the debt is cleared, and from this moment, you are the manager of this household, not its shadow." As the three of them sat together, the silence of the mansion was finally broken, not by the mechanical click of clocks or the cold scratch of pens, but by the sound of Ruby laughing as she reached for a piece of kalbi that was no longer a leftover. Taesung looked at his own plate, realizing that the sterile perfection he had demanded for decades was a hollow victory compared to the warmth of a child who no longer felt the need to be invisible. He had built an empire of fear, but as he watched Ruby eat, he realized he was finally building something that might actually last. A seat at the table for those the world had tried to throw away. The warmth of the dining room felt like a distant memory the moment Taesung stepped into the soundproofed depths of his basement war room. Waiting for him were three men who had helped him build his empire on a foundation of cold logic and colder violence. His senior advisor, a man named Min with eyes like polished flint, did not rise when Taesung entered. Instead, he tossed a surveillance photo onto the mahogany table. A grainy shot of Taesung's obsidian sedan parked in front of Shirley's dilapidated apartment building. "The streets are talking, Taesung," Min said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. "They say the dragon has traded his fire for a maid's apron. They say you are clearing debts for nobodies and playing house with a child who doesn't belong in our world." Taesung sat at the head of the table, his black blazer open to reveal the dark, intricate ink of the dragon on his chest. He remained silent, his serious and intense gaze fixed on Min. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight in the room, until another advisor leaned forward. "It's bad for business. Mercy is a contagion, boss. If the other families think you've gone soft for a girl in a pink dress, they'll start testing our borders by morning." Taesung finally moved, but it wasn't to reach for a weapon. He reached for a glass of water, his movements surgical and controlled. "You think power is measured by how many people you can step on," he said, his voice a low vibration that made the air in the room feel thin. "You think my authority is so fragile that a single act of protection shatters it." He stood up slowly, leaning over the table until he was inches from Min's face. The light caught the sharp jawline and the predatory focus in his dark eyes. "I didn't build this syndicate to be a slave to your fears. I built it so that when I decide a life has value, no one, not the debt collectors, not the rival families, and certainly not my own advisors, dares to question it. Tae-sung tapped the surveillance photo with a calloused finger. You call her a nobody. I call her the manager of my household. And that child? She is under my shadow. He straightened his jacket, his posture radiating a terrifying sense of purpose. If any of our business partners think this is a sign of weakness, tell them to come to the mansion. I'll show them personally that the dragon hasn't lost his teeth. He's just decided who is worth protecting. The advisors exchanged looks of genuine unease. They had seen Tae-sung's rage before, but this was something different. A cold, absolute conviction that was far more dangerous. He walked toward the door, stopping only to look back over his shoulder. Clean up the whispers, Min. If I hear another word about Shirley or Ruby being a liability, I will start making subtractions from this table. As he walked back toward the upper floors, Tae-sung felt the weight of his reputation settle back onto his shoulders, but it no longer felt like a burden. He had shown his men why he was the boss, not by hiding his humanity, but by wielding it like a blade. Tae-sung stepped out of the cold shadows of the war room and into the quiet, sun-drenched hallway of the mansion's private wing. He looked down at the dark, intricate ink of the dragon on his hand and realized that while his advisors feared his softness, they had no idea how much power he was truly capable of wielding when it wasn't for destruction. He pulled out his phone and made a single call to Seoul, bypassing his usual fixers and contacting a man whose hands were as legendary in the operating room as Tae-sung's were in the boardroom. Dr. Kong, Tae-sung said, his voice a low, steady vibration that left no room for negotiation. I have a patient, a 6-year-old girl with a congenital heart defect. I don't care about your schedule or the cost. My private jet is on the tarmac in Incheon. Be on it by midnight. 3 days later, the mansion was transformed from a fortress of secrets into a world-class medical suite. Tae-sung watched from the doorway as the specialist, a man who usually only treated heads of state, knelt to Ruby's level. Ruby sat on the edge of a velvet-cushioned chair, her pink dress a bright splash against the sterile white of the medical equipment. She looked at the doctor with her soft, youthful features, her blonde ponytail swaying as she tilted her head. Shirley stood in the corner, her trembling hands clutched together, her eyes glossy with tears as she watched the magic milk she had struggled to afford be replaced by the highest level of care the world could offer. She looked at Tae-sung, her expression one of profound, speechless gratitude. The East Asian man with the sharp jawline didn't look away. He remained focused on Ruby, his serious and intense gaze softening only when the child caught his eye and gave him a small, trusting smile. The procedure is complex, Mr. Lee, Dr. Kong noted, reviewing the scans with a frown. But with the equipment you've flown in, the success rate is high. She will never have to hide in the shadows again. Tae-sung nodded once, a gesture of absolute finality. He had spent millions on territory and silence, but as he watched the doctor explain the brave girl procedure to Ruby, he realized this was the first time his wealth had ever felt truly substantial. He was sparing no expense, not because it was good for business, but because he had promised a little girl on a kitchen floor that she wasn't a ghost anymore. Do it, Tae-sung commanded, his posture upright and composed, and ensure she has the best recovery suite in the city. I want her to wake up and see the skyline, not the floor. As the medical team began their preparations, Tae-sung walked Shirley to the window. She's going to be fine, Shirley, he said, his voice devoid of its usual lethal edge. The dragon doesn't let go of what he protects. The morning of the surgery arrived with a quiet, heavy tension that seemed to hold the entire mansion in its grip. Tae-sung stood in the doorway of the recovery suite, his black suit jacket buttoned tight, looking every bit the serious and intense mafia boss the city feared. He was preparing for a critical meeting with the heads of the 5 neighboring families, a summit where he would have to defend his recent diversions and prove his grip on the syndicate had not loosened. Ruby sat propped up against a mountain of white pillows, her soft features pale but her dark brown eyes bright with a resilience that humbled him. She was no longer wearing the pink long-sleeve dress. She was in a small hospital gown, but her blonde hair was still pulled back, though the ponytail was messy from a restless night. Shirley sat beside her, her glossy eyes reflecting a mixture of terror for the coming hours and a profound, quiet hope. As Taesung turned to leave, his jaw set for the coming conflict, a small voice stopped him. "Mr. Lee." He paused, his upright and composed posture softening just enough to look back. Ruby was reaching for her hair, her small fingers fumbling with the bright pink ribbon that usually held her ponytail in place. She pulled it free and held it out toward him, the silk fluttering in the sterile air of the room. "For your meeting," she whispered, her voice a thin but steady thread of sound. "Mommy says you're going to talk to mean men. If you take my ribbon, they won't be able to see the dragon. They'll only see my friend." Taesung felt a strange, sharp ache in his chest, a sensation far more potent than any physical wound he had ever sustained. He walked toward the bed, his dark eyes fixed on the simple piece of pink fabric. To his men, this was a trifle, a sign of weakness that would confirm every whisper of his softness. To him, it was a covenant. He didn't hesitate. He took his leather briefcase from the side table and, with hands that had orchestrated the fall of empires, carefully tied the pink ribbon around the handle. The bright, modest color stood in stark, dramatic contrast to the expensive black leather and the dark ink of the tattoos on his wrists. "I'll keep it safe, Ruby," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vow. "And when I come back, you're going to tell me all about the dreams you had while you were asleep." Shirley let out a shaky breath, her glossy eyes overflowing as she watched the most dangerous man in the city walk out of the room with a child's hair ribbon as his only shield. Taesung moved through the halls with a renewed, terrifying purpose. He wasn't just fighting for territory anymore. He was fighting to ensure that the world remained a place where a girl in a pink dress never had to hide again. As he entered the summit, the rival bosses stared at the briefcase, their expressions flickering with confusion and hidden scorn. But Taesung merely placed the case on the table, the pink ribbon front and center, and looked at them with a focused gaze so cold it silenced the room. He didn't need to explain it. He was the boss, and he had found something far more powerful than fear to lead him. The summit had ended not with a spray of bullets, but with the cold, absolute silence of men who realized that a dragon with something to protect was infinitely more dangerous than one with nothing to lose. Taesung returned to the mansion as the sun began to set, the pink ribbon still tied firmly to his briefcase, a bright streak of defiance against the dark leather. He bypassed his advisors and went straight to the recovery wing, where the sterile scent of medicine was already being replaced by the warm aroma of a fresh meal. Ruby was awake, her soft features glowing with a new, healthy strength as she sat upright in her bed. Shirley stood by her side, no longer the trembling shadow of a maid, but a woman whose upright posture finally matched the dignity she had always possessed. When Ruby saw Taesung, her dark eyes widened, and she pointed to the briefcase. "You kept it?" she whispered, her voice no longer a thin thread, but a clear, youthful sound. "Did the mean men see the dragon?" Taesung set the briefcase down and knelt beside her, his serious and intense gaze softening into something that left him unrecognizable to the criminal underworld. "They saw the ribbon, Ruby, and they learned that in this city, your name is just as powerful as mine." He looked at Shirley, who met his eyes without flinching, a silent understanding passing between them that the old hierarchy of the mansion had been permanently dismantled. He led them both back to the grand dining room, where the table was set not for a solitary boss, but for a family. As Ruby climbed into the head of house chair, Taesung realized that his true legacy would not be the territories he conquered or the ledgers he filled with blood-soaked profits. It would be the fact that this child would never again have to hide in a pantry or search the floor for her worth. He had spent 30 years building an empire of fear, but tonight, he inaugurated a new dynasty, one built on the promise that no one under his shadow would ever go hungry or invisible again. Taesung took his seat, the dark ink of the dragon on his chest finally feeling like a shield instead of a burden. He watched Ruby reach for a fresh plate of food with a confident, joyful hand, and for the first time in his life, the boss was truly at peace. He was no longer just a man of iron and blood. He was a guardian who had found his soul in the trust of a girl who had once texted the wrong number and found the right heart. What was your moral lesson from this story? What part of the story touched you the most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the Cinema Corner channel. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.